Florida is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I thank my colleague from Florida, my friend, for yielding me the customary 30 minutes. Departing for the moment at hand, Mr. Speaker, just to identify that today the bipartisan foster youth program has on the Hill with many of us foster care youth from around this nation. This bill directly affects their lives. I have the good fortune of having a constituent, Breon Callis, and a Washington, D.C. Youth, Goldie Brown, following me today, and I hope they hear my remarks and understand the importance to theirs and all children in America's future. The rule provides for consideration of 4 bills: the Intelligence Authorization, Energy and Water Appropriations, Homeland Security Appropriations, and Military Construction and Veterans Affairs Appropriations. While I agree with my colleague, Mr. Nugent, that it is important that this is customarily an open process, and I commend my Republican colleagues in that regard, I do, as I did in the Rules Committee, and he was there last evening, object to the significant number of amendments that were not allowed, and I'm sure there are members that will be present to speak to them. Once again, we're looking at broken Republican promises on spending levels. Once again, we're shortchanging our future for the selfish demands of today. And once again, we are missing the opportunity to fully invest in our nation. The choices made in these bills make no sense to me, Mr. Speaker. Nuclear weapons instead of non-proliferation. Fossil fuels instead of renewable energy. Divisive abortion provisions instead of bipartisan agreement on Homeland Security. It's almost as if Republicans enjoy jabbing a finger in the eye of progress. They seem to be doing everything they can to find ways not to grow our economy and create jobs. They do not seem to understand that clinging to fossil fuels and nuclear weapons at the expense of scientific research and energy efficiency will not bring about the kind of progress that this great nation needs. When you cut the Office of Science, when you cut the Advanced Research Projects Agency, and when you cut energy efficiency programs, you harm our ability to invest in the kinds of research that lead to innovation and job creation. Mr. Speaker, I could go through all these bills and point out everywhere the majority have not sufficiently invested in the kinds of programs we need to make progress. It would not be hard unless it involves military spending or oil. You can be sure that the majorities have cut it under the argument that we are in a fiscal crisis and cannot afford it. But I reject that notion. Mr. Speaker, we can afford to invest in our future, we can afford to create jobs, and we can afford to make the choices now that will reap the benefits for future generations, including those foster children that I mentioned. When President Bush wanted to invade Iraq, Congress spent $1 trillion. When Republicans wanted to cut taxes for the best off among us in America, Congress spent $1 trillion. When Congress wanted to fight the war on terror, it appropriated and still does nearly unlimited funding to do so. So this is not about the deficit. The United States does not lack the money to prioritize our future. What we do lack is the political willpower and the leadership necessary to set gainful priorities. Spend some now, save more later. What is obvious to middle class and working poor Americans seems entirely lost to my Republican colleagues. While this nation should be benefiting from American ingenuity and products made here in America, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle would rather let our other countries take the lead in scientific advancement, energy efficiency, and clean energy. I'm not just talking about this year's appropriations, Mr. Speaker. I'm talking about the trend under the Republican majority of defunding and deprioritizing the long-term needs of the nation. It's just plain depressing. I know that many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle would prefer to see climate change as a liberal hoax, clean energy as a socialist cabal, and science as a communist plot. But drastic changes are upon this country and indeed upon this world. And our failure to adequately address these challenges now will cost us more in the future. We need energy efficiency, not environmental degradation. We need nuclear non-proliferation, not more nuclear weapons. And we need more investments in science, because the next generation, including those foster children that I spoke about of American scientists and innovators, might not be one of the billionaires or millionaires so beloved by my Republican colleagues, but instead might be a desperate entrepreneur in need of a little bit of federal assistance in order to make that great scientific breakthrough. The sacrifices continually demanded by the Republican majority in order to provide ever more money for foreign wars and tax cuts for the wealthy, including those of us in Congress, are shortchanging the future of this nation. Rather than work with Democrats to develop bipartisan policies and funding priorities to address the country's challenges, House Republicans are continuing to use the appropriations process for partisan gimmickry and political gamesmanship and pretending by deeming something that ain't going to happen in the Senate as law. I can't tell you what business anti-abortion provisions have in a bill about funding the Department of Homeland Security. I can't tell you why it's more important for the Republicans to target women's health than it is to achieve bipartisan consensus on funding our nation's first responders. And I can't tell you why, Mr. Speaker, we still have to debate this issue when there are so many other pressing concerns before us today. Rather than garner Democrat support for the Homeland Security bill, Republicans felt the need to poison the legislation with erroneous abortion provisions regarding the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, rather than take seriously the need to fund disaster relief. And yes, it is true that tomorrow hurricane season begins, and we haven't done all or nearly as much as we should have, and there were amendments that would have addressed some of the things that we should, in fact, be prepared to do. Rather than take seriously firefighter assistance grants, cybersecurity efforts that are growing, the Coast Guard, the Secret Service, and other federal frontline agencies, the majority have cast aside cooperation in the name of what I believe is reckless ideological point scoring. So in this latest season of appropriations, Mr. Speaker, we find ourselves yet again cutting from valuable, worthwhile, and essential programs that would create jobs made in America, grow our economy, and ensure prosperity for the millions of Americans still struggling to get by. I reserve the balance of my time.